Elias Thorne leaned against the reinforced polymer of the Zenith Hub observation deck. Below him, the pale moon of Ethelgard spun like a marble of frosted glass, beautiful and cold. He wasn't a soldier anymore. The scars on his knuckles had faded into silver lines, though the ache in his knees from Earth's 1G pull remained a constant, heavy reminder of where he belonged. To the seraphim drifting past him in the corridor, he was a biological anomaly, a heavy gravity curiosity. They looked at his forward-facing eyes with a twitch of their iridescent crests, a silent recognition of the predator in the room. Too much mass. He took a slow sip of his synthesized mint tea. It was lukewarm and tasted faintly of wet copper, a byproduct of the station's aging recycler. It was a human taste, grounding and metallic, a stark contrast to the nectar scents the seraphim preferred. He watched his reflection in the glass. 43 years old, shoulders too broad for the delicate architecture of the station, eyes tired from decades of seeing things he wished he could forget. Overseer Vane had been blunt that morning. The Seraphim Archduchess was marrying into House Kalen, a union meant to solidify 10,000 years of avian tradition. They wanted a Terran representative to witness the rites. Specifically, they wanted the civilian contractor who had survived the siege of New Haven. They wanted to display the monster in a tailored black suit, an exotic beast to make their own grace seem even more divine. Elias had accepted because the Terran Council needed the alliance, and because he was used to being a ghost at someone else's feast. Have you ever wondered if the monsters in the stories are just people who stood their ground when everyone else ran? If you're ready to see what happens when a galaxy's predator finds something worth protecting, subscribe and join our watch. Now, we descend to the spires of Ethelgard. Beneath the crystal archways of the Prism Palace, a shadow moved. The shuttle ride had been an exercise in physical restraint. The Seraphim guards were hollow-boned and light, their movements a flurry of feathered elegance that made Elias feel like a lead weight dropped into a silk bag. When they touched down on the planet's surface, the 0.4G of Ethelgard made his every step feel like a dangerous, lunging motion. He had to consciously slow his heartbeat, feeling the terrifying power of his own muscles in a world where a misplaced stumble could shatter a noble's ribcage. The Great Hall was a cathedral of light, thousands of floating lanterns casting rainbows across the faces of the nobility. High Lord Kalen stood at the center, his crimson feathers drinking in the glow. He was a blade dancer, his twin crescent swords humming as he moved through a ceremonial greeting. He looked at Elias with the same clinical hunger a biologist might show for a new species of bacteria. If the Terran Council sees the report on this, Elias caught himself. He wasn't filing reports to the brass anymore. He was a civilian escort, a glorified piece of furniture meant to look intimidating while politicians lied in musical languages he barely understood. He stood in the corner, his back to a pillar of transparent stone, watching the predatory grace of the groom. A sharp, rhythmic clicking. It was the sound of seraphim beaks snapping in disapproval as Elias passed a group of elders. They whispered words like Deathworlder and Primitive, their iridescent crests flattened in a display of instinctive fear. Elias kept his face a mask of bored professional indifference. He was a master of the Terran stare, a technique of looking through people rather than at them, which only served to make the seraphim flinch harder. The Archduchess Lyra sat beside her father, her white robes flowing like clouds. Her face was a sculpture of marble, but her eyes were different. When they met his, they didn't hold fear. They held a desperate, burning intensity. Later that evening, she approached him in the garden, the scent of night-blooming jasmine thick enough to choke a human. She stood close, closer than any seraphim had ever dared. She didn't flinch from the heat radiating off his dense frame. "The stories say your kind never stops fighting," she whispered, her voice like wind through crystal. "They say you're forged in a world that hates life. I need to know if the stories are true, Elias Thorne." The garden air was thin, and every breath felt like a theft. Lyra watched him with an intensity that made Elias's skin prickle, her hand hovering near his scarred forearm. He looked down at the loose, nagging thread on the cuff of his formal black jacket, tugging at it until the seam tightened. It was a small, human frustration in a world of impossible elegance. The gravity here is almost like Elias started, his voice rasping. He was cut off by the sudden, discordant chime of a palace alarm. Inside the great hall, the celebration had soured. A seraphim noble, his feathers ruffled with fermented nectar and arrogance, had cornered a young servant girl. The girl's wings were pressed flat in a posture of total submission, trembling as the noble raised a sharpened ceremonial quill. Elias didn't think. He moved. The 0.4G of Ethelgard turned his stride into a blurred lunge that shattered the floor tiles where he landed. He caught the noble's wrist. The sound of hollow, avian bone groaning under his iron grip silenced the room. High Lord Kalen stepped forward, his eyes burning with a crimson hatred that matched his plumage. He demanded Elias's head for the insult of touching a peer. But Lyra stood between them, her voice ringing like a bell as she invoked the law of royal interest. Under the ancient code, Elias was now her ward, a piece on a board Kalen didn't realize he was playing. That night, in the shadows of the spire, Lyra told him the truth. Kalen hadn't just won his position. He had carved it out of her brother's chest. The wedding was a coup in silk robes, and by dawn, her father would be dead, and she would be a puppet, which meant the readings were wrong. The seraphim weren't peaceful. They were just better at hiding the blood. At the wedding altar, as the twin sons of Ethelgard crested the horizon, Elias stepped into the center of the rite. He didn't pull a weapon. Instead, he spoke a single word in the old tongue, Calvra, the decree of ash. The prism arena was a bowl of transparent stone that turned the morning light into a blinding kaleidoscope. Kalen moved like a gale, his crescent blades humming as they opened shallow red lines across Elias's chest. The seraphim nobility cheered, waiting for the clumsy death worlder to collapse from the blood loss. He did not fall. Elias absorbed the hits, his high-density muscle acting as a biological shield that the seraphim's light strikes couldn't penetrate. Because we are the children of a world that tried to kill us for 3 million years, a place of tectonic shifts and crushing pressure where survival wasn't a gift, but a prize snatched from the jaws of a starving apex predator. He caught Kalen midair. The High Lord's speed was useless against the crushing weight of a 1G grip. Elias slammed him into the crystal floor, the impact echoing like a thunderclap. Yield, Elias growled. Kalen looked up, his beak shattered, seeing his own frailty reflected in the Terran's cold, forward-facing eyes. He yielded. Hours later, the king sat with Elias in the recovery ward. The old sovereign looked at the human's bandages, then at the scuffed, silver-lined knuckles resting on the silk sheets. "You carry more than your own life, Commander," the king whispered. "You carry the truth of what we forgot. We are fragile. You are the mirror we were afraid to look into." "I'm just a contractor, Your Majesty," Elias replied. Lyra walked to the balcony, looking out at the new dawn. "Will you stay? Ethelgard needs someone who knows how to stand when the wind turns." Elias stood beside her, his hand finding the loose thread on his cuff one last time. He didn't pull it. He simply smoothed the fabric down, watching the twin suns turn the crystal spires into pillars of gold. If you want to see the moment the galaxy realizes their monsters are actually their protectors, come back tomorrow and join us. We'll be here. The silver-scuffed knuckles rested steady on the cold marble railing. The twin suns sank below the horizon, bathing the broken floor tiles in a deep, bruised purple. Beside him, the Archduchess didn't move, her wings folded in a quiet, heavy peace as the first stars of a new era began to burn.